friends, you're very welcome here to St. Mark's Church. And I know there's a number of you joining us from different countries. I know there's a number of you joining us from the United States. So good afternoon to you joining us here in St. Mark's Church in Tallaght on this beautiful, powerful prayer moment in the history of our world, where we're joining with Pope Francis and, of course, the bishops and all the faithful Catholics around the world in praying for the consecration of humanity, and particularly Russia and Ukraine, all to Mary's Immaculate Heart. Friends, before we dive deeper into our prayer here this evening with the Lord and the Blessed Mother, I think it's important we just, for a few moments, reflect on why it's significant what we're doing here tonight. As with many of the formal aspects of Catholic faith, understanding what we're doing is very important. Everybody, if we're all honest, the reason why you and I are gathered here this evening like this, on our knees, praying with the successor of St. Peter in Rome, is because of the very real threat of a Third World War, which now seems to be looming in the eastern part of Europe. The mass numbers of men, women and children fleeing horrible violence and the human degradation in war-torn cities and villages, it rightly and should repulse us and disgust us in so many respects. But we also, I think, know everyone deep in our hearts that the players involved in the war in Ukraine have very serious potentiality to spread this war further. And I think there's a threat like no other at the moment, because all of us have a notion in some shape or form of the absolute horror that could be unleashed upon this planet if the fears, the suspicions, and the hatred of a world war in our time is allowed to build up. What's happening in Rome at the moment and throughout the world, and even here this evening, it's not a joke. This is not a nice thing to do. It's not pious fantasy here this evening. This has to be taken serious, everybody, because of the vast spiritual ramifications it had for history and for peace in our world. Since the 17th century, there's a false notion, everyone, of what's called Deism. It's this idea that God created the world, He created the universe, the animals, and you and me. But that's it. He left us to our own designs, to our own wills, to carry out and do what we want. He steps back. That is a direct contradiction to our Christian faith, and very much a contradiction to what Jesus speaks about in the gospel. Remember where He says, "Not a single sparrow falls to the ground in this planet without God the Father knowing. He knows the number of hairs on our heads." That's how deeply involved God is in our lives and the affairs of the world. That's why, and friends, I think it's important we analyze the events of our lives and the world history through the prism of the gospel. And to formally consecrate humanity, in particular Russia and Ukraine, to Mary's Immaculate Heart, it's a spiritual earthquake we're talking about here. It's the successor of St. Peter, pleading with God to intervene in a very specific way at this juncture of our human and world history. In essence, everybody, the words of our Saviour Jesus to St. Peter, where having proclaimed him as the rock to build upon the church, he also proceeds to say to Peter, "I give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on this earth will be considered bound in heaven." That, folks, is truly immense spiritual power that we're talking about. The power of the papacy and the prayers of the faithful worldwide are now locked in a single purpose, in seeking God's direct intervention before a possible global war. And in this, we're turning to Mary tonight, God's mother, the Queen of heaven and the Queen of earth, and entrusting what's broken in us and in the world to her hands, her Immaculate Heart. Now, we're 105 years on since the apparitions of Fatima, where Our Lady requested three things specifically: rosary daily, second, the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart, and three, a devotion around the world to her heart. And folks, when you think about it, for her to say such things like to consecrate Russia to three young shepherd children who could barely read or write was quite extraordinary. because the Marxist revolution had not yet taken place in Russia when these apparitions took place. So she was warning the world what's about to come if we don't consecrate the world, and particularly Russia, to our heart. And friends, the 20th century, it has opened the window to all of us into what a godless society can do in terms of the sheer dismay of human cruelty, barbaric acts that did and can continue to be carried out. What happens when we erode human dignity based on God? I mean, even the great atheist philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, as we all know, he famously said, God is dead. And therefore, the modern world is built on that premise. But what we don't realize, he also very much lamented what happens when God is removed from society, when solid spiritual and moral foundations are removed. And he spoke about the gathering storm of what he called nihilism, this idea that life now has no meaning. There is no truth. There is no meaning to our life, why we suffer, etc., and what that leads to. A taste of which, folks, we experienced in this world during the Second World War, especially in regards to the dehumanization of the Jews of Europe and how the splitting of the atom has continued to lead us in a constant threat of nuclear annihilation. And John Paul II, he prayed for the consecration of Russia to Mary, as he knew himself all too well what happens when human civilization tries to flourish without God. And today, the moral erosion is on a scale I don't think we've ever seen before, and allied with a ferocious aggression towards the Christian faith and the gospel. That the threat of nuclear war has now dawned once again in our own time. And it's into this real spiritual threat, physical and psychological evil, we kneel together before Jesus Christ and his Blessed Mother this evening. Just like that of St. Magdalene, St. John, and Our Lady at the foot of the cross, where they too looked upon the horror that was taking place before their eyes. Friends, in short, the act of consecration, it's a dramatic gesture in prayer to lift up this moment in time that you and I are living and experiencing, which is in a profound state of crisis, particularly with human nature, lifting all of this up to God through Mary. That's what this evening is about. To consecrate ourselves, nations, to Mary is nothing new. Christ himself did this on the cross as he was dying on the cross. He said to St. John, "Behold your mother," consecrating the apostles to his Blessed Mother. This is a divine will that we're talking about, everyone. It's as serious as it gets spiritually and authoritatively of our faith. Consecration to Mary, it's simply a furthering and a deepening of our devotion to and a relationship with Jesus Christ through his mother. I know a lot of people today, they ask the question, why is it necessary to have a relationship with Mary when I have faith in Jesus? I go to Mass, I say my prayers. Mary is kind of a sideline. Folks, we have to remember who we're talking about here. We're talking about the Mother of God, first and foremost. Someone who said a profound, deep yes to God's will, which is what today's feast day, the Annunciation, is all about. And as such, folks, she only wants what's good for you and me, like any good mother. She wants us to go to heaven more than we do ourselves. Such is her love and her dedication to us and the children of God. She's invested in our good, in our happiness, but also in our sorrow. And that's why she takes all our prayers together with her own and offers them to God. And at the end of the day, Jesus does not refuse his own mother. Why? Because she never refuses him. And as nations, as society, and even our own humanity begins to spiral more and more out of control, in a time where real sin is having a detrimental effect on our minds, our hearts, and our souls, Mary's intervention is essential. And it's all the more for you and me to pay attention to her in the last days. As St. Maximilian Kolbe, who knew too well of the horror of man's inhumanity to man, who died at Auschwitz death camp, he once said, "Prayer is powerful beyond limits when we turn to to the Immaculate, Mary, who is queen not only of this good earth and heaven, but queen of God's heart. What an extraordinary insight he received of Mary's power, the power of her mothership, the authority of her crowning as queen of heaven and earth. And that's what we're doing this evening. So friends, let's together, as lovers of Jesus on this good earth, turn to our Holy Mother Mary tonight with the Holy Father and the faithful throughout the world, and genuinely seek her blessed intervention in these extraordinary times where it seems that peace, love, compassion, hope, and understanding must now once again come from direct intervention from God.